The bunting had been troublesome all week, drooping in sulky festoons from the copper beech and tangling itself with the rose arch, as if the flag cords had decided to prefer gravity to celebration. By Saturday afternoon, however, it had been coaxed into cheerful compliance for the St. Mary Mead Garden Society's summer tea at the old rectory. The borders were crisp-edged with marigolds, a pyramid of jam jars gleamed scarlet and amber on the trestle table, and the village assembled with the particular satisfaction that comes from arranging something perfectly to the last crumb. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the plane tree, where dappled shadows fell in gentle patterns across the grass. Her knitting needles clicked placidly while her observant blue eyes meandered over friends and neighbors with the deceptive casualness of someone whose presence could be safely ignored. This quality of appearing utterly harmless meant that she observed, almost by default, everything worth observing. Mrs. Octavia Hartwell presided by the tea-urn with the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She wore mauve from hat to lipstick, the latter having strayed slightly beyond its designated boundary and dispensed both tea and benevolence with equal measure. Having purchased the old rectory after the last rector retired to Bournemouth, she had graciously offered her garden for the occasion and accepted the village's gratitude as her due. Perched beside her like an anxious sparrow sat Miss Edith Vale, the Garden Society's treasurer, physically guarding the tin of shillings and sixpences while biting her lip with nervous precision. Her ink-stained fingers betrayed long hours spent over account books, and she clutched the money box as if expecting it to sprout legs and flee. Dr. Lionel Brooks stood near the jam display, pleased with his handsome profile and anticipating compliments on his roses. He was a man who enjoyed being consulted and, failing that, being allowed to correct others. In his pocket rested a small speech of gratitude, ready for deployment should Mrs. Hartwell desire public acknowledgment of her generosity. Among the assembled villagers, Miss Marple noted the presence of Guy Farnley, Mrs. Hartwell's nephew, whose casual navy blazer without a tie caused his aunt's mouth to tighten each time she glanced his way. He had been seen in London doing something theatrical, and more recently at the Crown with glasses he did not pay for with sufficient alacrity. Today, he stood by the croquet lawn with an air of studied nonchalance that fooled no one. Lily Arkwright, the schoolmistress, moved through the gathering like a bright forget-me-not in her blue dress, offering assistance where needed while maintaining the professional cheerfulness that served her well in managing both children and village politics. Her quick glances between guests suggested someone accustomed to reading situations and preventing small disasters before they occurred. Lydia Quince took evident pride in her management of the tea service, arranging cups and saucers with military precision. Each handle pointed exactly at 4 o'clock, and she fussed over the starched white cloth that covered the long trestle table. Miss Marple's wandering gaze noted Lydia's swift correction of a small stain near the table's edge, the quick rub of her apron leaving behind only the faint, incongruous scent of lemons. "2 lumps, Major, and mind the wasps," Mrs. Hartwell announced to Major Pritchard, whose red cheeks and parade-ground posture made him look perpetually ready for inspection. "We're all friends here." The Major harumphed at a persistent wasp, missed his swat, and watched his cake slide dangerously on its paper napkin. "Dashed creatures. Nothing to what we endured in Burma, of course." He looked around hopefully for acknowledgement of his military service, received polite nods, and added more loudly, "Fine show of dahlias, Mrs. Hartwell. Absolutely first-rate." It was during this pleasant exchange that the first curious incident occurred. Guy Farnley, leaning across to rescue a sliding plate, somehow caused a cup that Lydia had carefully positioned to wobble and then, quite delicately, slide forward 2 inches and tip itself over the table's edge. It fell to the grass with a hollow china sound and broke into 3 neat pieces, tea spreading darkly into the earth. "The table's never quite level," Lydia observed, as if to herself. "I told Mr. Waring we needed proper wedging." "It's the ground," Dr. Brooke pronounced with authority. "These old lawns settle. Matter of drainage, really." Miss Marple's hands continued their steady knitting rhythm, but her mind noted several things. The cup had moved without being touched. Lily Arkwright had watched the incident with held breath as if expecting some lesson to emerge, and Edith Vale's fingers had tightened protectively on her money tin, though tea was free and coins were only for the raffle. The Reverend Pottle cleared his throat, and the gathering arranged itself with familiar choreography to hear his blessing. Children wriggled into stillness, ladies balanced their plates with practiced precision, and the Major consulted his watch. A bee, as always present at matters of village consequence, veered past Miss Marple's shoulder toward the tea-urn. "Friends," the Reverend began, "we gather today to celebrate the fruits of our labor, the sweetness of fellowship." Mrs. Hartwell lifted her cup then, not one of the distant, treacherous cups, but a sturdy one with a chipped handle. She smiled over the rim at her guests, the picture of unflappable hostess. But before she could drink, Edith Vale tugged at her sleeve. The money tin was too heavy. Could she help? Mrs. Hartwell made a patient face, took the tin, set it beside the urn, and patted Edith's hand reassuringly. The cry from the garden. "And yet we are blessed with rest, with the companionship of neighbors." The Reverend's words were interrupted by a cry from beyond the lilac hedge. Not a scream, which is theatrical and sharp, but the ancient sound a person makes when the world gives way beneath them. Agnes Reed, Mrs. Hartwell's maid, stood at the lawn's edge, her hair escaping under her cap, her apron twisted in both hands. "Madam, Mrs. Hartwell, oh, come quickly, Mrs. Hartwell moved with surprising speed for her size, stepping around the table and pushing through the lilac hedge toward the house's side door. Guy followed with a strangled Aunt Octavia, while others maintained proper English restraint for exactly 3 counts before following with deliberate purpose. Miss Marple rose unhurriedly, smoothed her skirt, and as she passed the tea table, glanced once at the cup with the chipped handle. Inside was a brown ring where tea had rested, untouched. She detected the faintest sweetness, furniture polish perhaps, or the lingering scent of Lydia's lemon-scented apron. In the cool stone passage that smelled of beeswax and age, Agnes had collapsed onto a chair while Guy stood frozen in the morning-room doorway, his hands lifted uselessly in the air. His face wore the appalled blankness of someone who had rehearsed disasters but found the reality unimaginably different. Mrs. Hartwell lay on the carpet in the ungainly way that people do not lie unless something vital has stopped inside them. One arm was crooked beneath her, the other flung out as if, in her final moment, she had tried to push away her fate. Dr. Brooke appeared with the practiced swiftness that doctors, like cats, employ when needed most. He dropped to his knees with reassuring briskness. "Stand back, give her air. Major, that window. The sash, not the casement." The gathering hovered between shock and the need to be practical. The Reverend's face had gone pale. Nora Pottle caught her breath. Lily Arkwright pressed her hand to her mouth, then removed it, refusing to be the sort of woman who swooned. Edith Vale looked at Miss Marple with wide-eyed confusion, as if the elderly lady might declare this all a misunderstanding. Miss Marple did not. She stood very still and observed. Guy's crooked cuff, the scuff on Mrs. Hartwell's shoe, the darker patch on the hearth rug where something had been hastily dabbed away. Most particularly, she observed the saucer on the window table, a saucer without its cup, bearing a crescent of milk along its edge like a knowing smile. "Heart," Dr. Brooke announced from his position beside the body. "Very sudden. She appears to have... Yes, quite sudden." Murmurs began. Shock, speculation, the flutter of voices seeking explanation. Agnes wept with the large, honest sobs of someone who had not learned to apologize for grief. "What did you see, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently, as if inquiring about a lost button. Agnes gulped air. "I brought the napkins, miss, like she asked, and she was here, and she said, 'I'll just sit a moment.' And then she made this sound. Like, like, like the pump when it loses its prime," Major Pritchard supplied helpfully, for whom every mystery was ultimately mechanical. As the village began its necessary movements, someone for a blanket, someone for Constable Bell, someone to mind the children, Miss Marple made her way back through the lilac hedge. On the trestle table, Lydia's perfect row of cups showed a gap where one had not been replaced. On the grass, a fragment of that first self-sacrificing cup glittered like a white tooth in the afternoon sun. By evening, it would be said that Mrs. Hartwell's heart had given out on the very day she had given tea to the village. By nightfall, it would be added that she had been strong as an ox that morning. Before the week ended, someone would remark upon the curious incident of the teacup that seemed to tip itself. Miss Marple did not yet voice what she thought of teacups that moved without hands. She simply asked Nora Pottle if there might be another of those very nice seed cakes, giving the flustered woman a welcome task, while her own mind began sorting the bright, thin threads of village life into their proper patterns. Outside, a soft wind moved over the lawn like whispered secrets. Inside, the morning room held its new and terrible silence. And in Miss Marple's orderly mind, one particular thread had made itself known, though there would be a proper moment, as in all good work, for the drawing out. The teacup had tipped itself, and Mrs. Hartwell was dead. In the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, these two facts would prove to be far from unconnected. Constable Bell arrived with the apologetic briskness of a man who does not often attend tragedies but is determined to do what is proper. He took off his helmet at the morning room door, looked at Mrs. Hartwell as one might look at a toppled portrait, and cleared his throat. Dr. Brooke was on his feet by then, smoothing his cuffs, his manner professionally grave. He spoke of sudden failures and familial histories, of strain and the heat of the afternoon, and the constable, relieved to have a word like heart to put in his notebook, wrote it down with care. Miss Marple, at a little distance, listened without appearing to listen at all. She had drifted toward the little table under the window and regarded the saucer waiting there. It had on its edge that crescent of milk, not a spill so much as the leftover curl of an intention. "Dear me," she murmured, not to be heard. She remembered, as one remembers small things, that Mrs. Hartwell always took a slice of lemon with her tea, and had once told Mrs. Price Ridley that milk was a mistake past 40. Agnes, when gently asked, confirmed it with the anxious exactitude of the servant who knows her mistress's ways. "Lemon for madam, always," she said. She said milk made her feel queer. The current of people set itself in motion and then eddied, as village currents will. Nora Pottle shepherded the children away with gentle firmness and a large promise about seed cake. Major Pritchard moved purposefully between window and hearth, glancing about for something mechanical to set right. Lily Arkwright fetched water for Agnes, and then stood with the glass untouched in her hand, as if the act of fetching had been the important part. Edith Vale hovered by the door, clasping the money tin to her chest, and started visibly each time someone spoke her name. Lydia Quince appeared at the door then, wiping her hands on her apron and doing her best not to look into the room. "Shall I tidy, Doctor?" she asked, her voice low and eager. The scent of lemon came with her, the bright domestic smell that in other circumstances suggested floors newly scrubbed and teacups cleared away. Miss Marple saw Lydia's gaze flit to the saucer, then away, and noticed something else beneath the lemon scent. Something sharper, like polish applied in haste. "Best leave things as they are for the present," Dr. Brooks said. Lydia nodded, swallowed, and vanished again like a careful wren. Guy Farnley had the posture of a man trying to keep his shoulders from reaching his ears. He smoked with unnecessary force behind the lilac hedge, where he thought he could not be seen. His eyes darted about, avoiding direct contact, particularly with Lily Arkwright, who hesitated as she passed him. She said something that made him laugh with too much breath in it, and then she moved on, scolding herself for kindnesses that might be mistakes. Miss Marple, having made herself of use to Nora by tying an obstinate ribbon, drifted toward the trestle table as though merely interested in the jam. She touched the cloth with the back of her hand and found, in one place near the edge, a faint tackiness, as if someone had spilled something sweet and then wiped it carefully. Her eyes went to the gap where the first broken cup had been, and to the little triangle of china still on the grass, unnoticed by Lydia's careful eye in the confusion. Edith, still hugging the tin, came close enough to be overheard. "I told her to let me mind it," she said to no one in particular. She laughed and said the village wouldn't run off with itself. Her eyes were red and defiant. Miss Marple's gaze rested for a moment on the tin, remembering the way Mrs. Hartwell had set it down by the urn. It had seemed heavier than a rattling of small coins should be. Sometimes, she thought, people hid things in what they considered beneath notice. By evening, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar velocity that accompanies unexpected death in small communities. At the post office, Mrs. Clement declared that she had always suspected Mrs. Hartwell's complexion was too high for a woman of her years. The Mrs. Weatherby agreed that the deceased had seemed rather flushed at morning service the previous Sunday, though they differed on whether this indicated impending, apoplexy, or merely the effects of her new powder compact. The next morning, Lily Arkwright walked past Miss Marple's gate 3 times before finally stopping to inquire about the health of her prize delphiniums. The young schoolmistress wore her second-best hat and carried her prayer book with the particular care of someone whose mind was elsewhere entirely. "Such a terrible shock about Mrs. Hartwell," Lily ventured, running her gloved finger along the fence post. "I keep thinking about yesterday afternoon, how perfectly normal everything seemed until—" She paused, then added with apparent casualness, "Though I must say, I did notice something rather odd just before we heard poor Agnes cry out. It was probably nothing, just my imagination, but I could have sworn I saw someone moving about near the morning room window. Just a shadow, really, but it seemed deliberate somehow. Not like a servant going about their duties, but more furtive, I suppose." Miss Marple's hands remained perfectly still on her gardening gloves, but her attention sharpened. In her considerable experience, when people began noticing odd details about perfectly ordinary events, it usually meant that the events had been rather less ordinary than they appeared. She filed away Lily's observation with the same methodical care she applied to pressing flowers, each detail to be examined later, compared with others, and eventually arranged into whatever pattern they naturally formed. In Miss Marple's mind, the threads gathered themselves, a cup that moved as if urged to its fate, a saucer with milk where lemon should have been, a hostess who had not drunk her tea, a treasurer's tin that felt improbably weighty, and a diligent woman whose apron smelled of readiness beneath its lemon brightness. The village was settling into its theories with comfortable certainty, but Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous assumptions were often the most reasonable ones. Miss Marple invited Lily in for tea, sensing that the young woman's 3 passes by her gate indicated a mind wrestling with uncomfortable thoughts. They settled in the sitting room, where the afternoon light fell gently across the good china, and Miss Marple poured with the unhurried precision that encouraged confidences. Lily accepted milk without being asked, which told Miss Marple that the schoolmistress was more distracted than she wished to appear. "I keep wondering if I should mention what I saw to Constable Bell," Lily continued, stirring her tea with unnecessary attention. "About the shadow, I mean. But it seems so vague now, and I worry people might think I was being fanciful." She paused, then added with the particular honesty that comes with genuine worry, "The truth is, I'm not entirely certain what I did see. It might have been Guy, or Dr. Brooke, or even Lydia going about her duties. But there was something about the way the person moved that struck me as deliberate, as if they were trying not to be noticed. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly while cataloguing this information alongside yesterday's observations. In her experience, people who tried not to be noticed usually had excellent reasons for their discretion. "How curious," she murmured. And this was just before poor Agnes discovered Mrs. Hartwell. "Yes, perhaps 5 minutes before. I was helping Major Pritchard with his napkin when something caught my eye." Lily set down her cup with a small clink. "Miss Marple, do you think it's possible that Mrs. Hartwell didn't that there might have been some other cause?" The question hung between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Miss Marple considered her response carefully, aware that the young woman was asking something she had not quite dared to think through completely. "My dear, in my experience, when several unusual things happen in close succession, they are often connected in ways that become apparent only later. A teacup that moves without being touched, a saucer with milk where lemon should be, and now a shadow that moves with purpose rather than accident." After Lily left, Miss Marple put on her walking shoes and made her way toward the village proper. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Clement held court behind the counter with the authority of someone who had sorted the village's correspondence for 30 years. The conversation began with inquiries about health and weather before settling on Mrs. Hartwell's shocking suddenness. "Such a vigorous woman," Mrs. Clement declared, stamping a parcel with unnecessary force. "Why, only last week she was in here asking about registered post to London. Very particular about it, she was. Wanted to be certain it would arrive by Thursday." Mrs. Clement leaned closer, lowering her voice to the confidential tone reserved for truly interesting information. "Between you and me, Miss Marple, I had the impression it was something rather important. Legal papers, perhaps. She seemed quite anxious about the timing." Miss Marple accepted this intelligence with appropriate interest while mentally noting that Mrs. Hartwell had been conducting business requiring both secrecy and urgency. Her next stop was the baker's, where Mr. Crump shared his observation that Mrs. Hartwell had seemed quite herself Friday morning when collecting her order for the tea. "Ordered extra jam tarts," he recalled, wiping flour from his hands. "Said she wanted everything perfect for the Garden Society, particular about the arrangement too." He paused, then added carefully, "Though I must say, she did seem a bit distracted. Asked me twice about the delivery time as if she had something pressing on her mind." Walking home through lengthening shadows, Miss Marple encountered Constable Bell making his rounds with the conscientious air of a man determined to do things properly. She mentioned, as if only just remembered, that Mrs. Hartwell had always preferred lemon in her tea, and that the saucer in the morning room had shown a crescent of milk, which seemed curious. Bell's pencil paused over his notebook. "Milk," he repeated. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but I understood the doctor to mean natural causes." Miss Marple murmured something about cause and effect not always being on nodding terms and suggested, in her fluttering way that never failed to calm policemen, that it might be sensible to examine what remained in the jugs if they had not been washed. At the old rectory, they found Agnes red-eyed and Lydia Quince polishing silver with desperate zeal in the back passage. The sharp note of metal polish threaded through her usual lemon scent like a discord. When Bell suggested she leave the silver for now, Lydia's hands paused, but she did not quite meet his eye. "I like to keep things decent, Constable," she said. "It helps one's thoughts." In the morning room, the saucer remained by the window, its crescent mark delicate and opaque. Miss Marple's gaze slipped from saucer to window latch, which shone too brightly for its neighbors and bore a faint smear where polish had strayed. She touched the sill with one gloved finger and felt the faint grain of dust broken by recently placed weight. Agnes told her story again, grief making it circle back upon itself. She came in quick, saying she would just sit a minute. "Madame never let me bring milk into the morning room unless for scones, and those went on a tray. She didn't like things sticky." Agnes's look flicked guiltily at the saucer. "I never put that there. Madame would have scolded." As Bell noted, names and theories began forming around Guy Farnley's obvious needs. Miss Marple drifted back to the garden where the trestle table still held its line of cups. She found one whose saucer edge bore minute granulation, as if syrup had dried there and been lightly wiped. When she lifted the broken cup fragment from the grass and examined its inner curve, she detected the faintest bloom, not brown like tea, but whitish, like scum dried in haste. The village would content itself with Guy and his debts, but Miss Marple, who knew the ways of need in all its quieter forms, sensed something else entirely, something that had been arranged like a place setting, then very carefully wiped clean. By Tuesday morning, the village had arranged itself around the comfortable certainty that Guy Farnley was their man. The evidence fell into place with the satisfying weight of coins in a collection box. His debts were village knowledge, his inheritance would solve them handsomely, and his nervous fidgeting since Saturday spoke volumes to those inclined to listen. Mrs. Price Ridley declared at the butcher's that she had always suspected theatrical people of fundamental unreliability, while the Mrs. Weatherby recalled with suspicious precision that Guy had been asking pointed questions about his aunt's financial arrangements only last month. Miss Marple, however, found herself troubled by the very tidiness of this solution. In her considerable experience with human nature, genuine guilt rarely announced itself so obviously, while calculated innocence often did. She had observed Guy at the tea party, noted his studied nonchalance and his awkward attempts to appear unaffected. While his financial difficulties were undoubtedly real, his distress at discovering his aunt had seemed genuine, if poorly expressed. She recalled the way his hands had lifted uselessly in the morning-room doorway, the appalled blankness of his face, not the cunning of a murderer, but the shock of a rather feckless young man confronted with something beyond his comprehension. Her thoughts returned instead to details that had no place in Constable Bell's increasingly confident narrative. She made her way to Edith Vale's cottage, where the treasurer sat at her round table with the money tin beside a plate of untouched Bath buns, as if the entire village economy had settled there and dared her to look away. Edith's fingers, still bearing yesterday's ink stains, worried the rim of her saucer with mechanical persistence. "I couldn't sleep for it," Edith confessed when Miss Marple inquired gently after her health. "The tin. I kept thinking, what if something of Mrs. Hartwell's is in there? She took it from me, and then she put it down, and then she... And in the confusion I took it back because I thought, this is my responsibility. But I haven't opened it, Miss Marple. I did not want to know what might be inside." Miss Marple drew the tin nearer and felt its weight with the careful attention she might give to testing fruit for ripeness. Coins rattled with their expected metallic music, but there was something else. The sound had a muffled quality, as if metal did not fall quite as far as it should. "Sometimes it is best to know," she said gently. "One is then spared the various unkindnesses of imagination." With trembling fingers, Edith produced the key from the chain about her neck. Inside lay the expected shillings and sixpences in their familiar disorder, but Miss Marple's experienced touch found what her ear had detected. Running a fingertip around the tin's interior, she discovered the faintest lip that did not belong to honest construction. With the delicacy of someone turning pages in an ancient prayer book, she eased up a thin false bottom that revealed its secret with a whisper of waxed paper. Beneath lay a small brass key, its head stamped with a tiny flower that might have been a larkspur, and a slip from the post office. "Registered post, Monday last, addressed to Pember and Wyatt, Lincoln's Inn." Edith's breath caught in her throat like a small, frightened bird. "How very thoughtful of Mrs. Hartwell," Miss Marple murmured, examining the key with interest. The delicate flower marking suggested the sort of whimsical identification that country house carpenters had favored when the world moved more slowly and people expected their furniture to have personalities. "I think we should share this discovery with Constable Bell." At the old rectory, Lydia Quince opened the door with an expression that attempted blankness but failed at its edges. The sharp scent of lemon oil rose from the hallway like an overeager greeting, and when Belle explained about the key, Lydia's gaze flickered toward the morning room before she could prevent it. "Mrs. Hartwell didn't keep private papers in there," she said with unnecessary speed. "She was always up in her bedroom for correspondence. The morning room was for callers only." Miss Marple made a small, agreeable sound that neither contradicted nor confirmed this assertion. Even so, people are often inconsistent in their habits on days when they feel pressed for time. The morning room received them with its deceptive calm. Miss Marple went directly to the small writing bureau, a graceful piece whose brass fittings had been worn to silk by generations of hands. The larkspur key slid home as if remembering an old friendship, and the drawer marked with a tiny, age-browned label clicked open to reveal precisely nothing. Not even the dust one expects when people keep secrets carelessly. Lydia made a small sound in her throat and swallowed it whole. Miss Marple examined the drawer's interior with the methodical attention of someone reading invisible text. The base showed the faint shadow where a packet had rested long enough to leave the ghost of its dimensions, and caught on a splinter near the runner was a single thread of bright blue. The exact shade of Lily Arkwright's simple dress from yesterday, though blue was common enough in summer and many women favored it for its practicality. "Someone has been here," Edith whispered behind them, her voice cracking like old paper. "Recently," Miss Marple agreed, not looking at Lydia, whose breathing had become carefully controlled. "And with considerable urgency, I should think. Constable Bell, you'll want to inquire who has had access to the house since yesterday. People are often wonderfully helpful during times of grief, and kindness can take so many forms." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Brooke materialized in the hallway with the particular suddenness that medical men cultivate for appearing where they are needed. He carried his hat and wore the expression of professional concern mixed with curiosity that such occasions demand. He had come, he explained, to collect Mrs. Hartwell's medical records, perfectly routine in cases of unexpected death, though he felt compelled to mention that she had consulted him recently about feelings of being observed, of sensing watchful eyes even when alone. "Nervous exhaustion," he diagnosed retrospectively. "Common enough in women of her circumstances and age." Miss Marple accepted this information with the same gentle attention she'd given the empty drawer. If Mrs. Hartwell had indeed felt herself under observation, her recent attention to registered letters and locked drawers took on a more urgent character. Someone had been watching, and someone had been watched, and now someone was dead while important papers had vanished as completely as morning mist. Walking home through the village streets, Miss Marple turned these elements over in her mind like pieces of a puzzle that had not yet revealed their proper arrangement. The obvious solution remained Guy Farnley with his convenient motives and transparent distress, but she found herself increasingly certain that obviousness was precisely what someone had worked to achieve. The real question was not who had reason to want Mrs. Hartwell dead, but who possessed both the cleverness to arrange her death and the foresight to ensure that suspicion would fall elsewhere entirely. The teacup that had moved without hands, the milk where lemon should have been, the drawer emptied of its secrets. These were not the random accidents of natural death. They were the careful arrangements of someone who understood that the most successful deceptions were those that looked like simple misfortune, leaving investigators to chase shadows while the truth polished itself bright as a window latch and twice as slippery. The discovery of the empty drawer with its telltale blue thread had left Miss Marple with more questions than answers, but she had learned long ago that the most productive investigations often began with the smallest details. The larkspur key that had unlocked nothing suggested there might be more to discover, and a conversation with Lily about shadows at windows had planted a seed of suspicion that required careful tending. Her first stop was Mr. Waring's carpenter shop, where the scent of wood shavings and honest labor provided a welcome contrast to the increasingly complex atmosphere surrounding Mrs. Hartwell's death. The elderly craftsman examined the brass key with the appreciation of someone who understood fine workmanship, his weathered fingers tracing the delicate flower, stamping with reverence. "Old Petherick's work," he confirmed, nodding with satisfaction. Master cabinet-maker he was, though gone these 50 years. Had a way with hidden compartments that was near to artistry. That bureau in the morning room would be one of his pieces, I'd wager. He always put a little secret well behind the main drawer, accessible only if you knew the trick of it. Mr. Waring's eyes brightened with professional interest. You'd press just so along the grain of the wood inside the writing compartment, and a narrow drawer would slide out smooth as silk. Meant for private papers, love letters, that sort of thing. Miss Marple thanked him with genuine warmth and made her way back to the old rectory, where Constable Bell was persuaded to accompany her for what she described as a small matter of thoroughness. They found the house in its usual state of subdued activity, with Agnes moving about her duties like a ghost, and Lydia maintaining her determined cheerfulness with the sort of brightness that suggested considerable effort beneath. In the morning room, Miss Marple approached the bureau with the methodical patience of someone who had spent decades coaxing secrets from reluctant places. Her fingers found the hidden mechanism exactly where Mr. Waring had indicated, and with the softest click, a narrow compartment slid into view. Like its companion drawer, it had been thoroughly emptied, but Miss Marple's careful examination revealed traces that spoke volumes to her experienced eye. A small amount of green sealing wax had been scraped along one edge, and caught in the wood grain was a single hair, pale as winter wheat and far too fine to belong to Mrs. Hartwell's carefully maintained silver curls. Constable Bell noted these findings with growing interest, while Miss Marple filed them away alongside her other observations about people who moved with purpose through houses where they were trusted completely. Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Guy Farnley, whose usual studied nonchalance had given way to genuine distress. The young man's collar was askew, his hair bore the marks of anxious fingers, and he carried himself with the particular misery of someone who had discovered that village suspicion, once aroused, spread faster than good news and lasted considerably longer. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "I know how everything appears, and I can hardly blame people for their suspicions. But there's something I observed on Saturday that doesn't fit with the theory that I murdered my aunt, and I thought you might be the only person willing to listen without having already made up your mind." Miss Marple settled herself in the window chair and regarded him with the gentle attention that had encouraged confidences for more than 70 years. Guy perched on the edge of a straight-backed chair and began his account with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed it many times in his own mind. "I was standing by the croquet lawn, trying to avoid conversations about my prospects, when I noticed Lydia leave the tea service. She carried a small tray with a single cup and saucer, and instead of using the side entrance as the servants usually do, she went directly to the front door. She was gone for what seemed rather longer than necessary for simply delivering tea, and when she returned, she spent considerable time rearranging things on the table as if they weren't quite right." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm while her mind catalogued this information alongside her growing collection of observations. "Did you notice anything else about her manner, Mr. Farnley?" "She seemed purposeful, if that makes sense. Not hurried, but as if she had something specific to accomplish. And there was something in her apron pocket that made it bulge more than usual, as if she were carrying something with some weight to it." Guy paused, then added with painful honesty, "I've been staying at the Crown since last week, and yesterday evening I overheard her talking with someone outside my window. She sounded agitated, saying something about things having to be done and there being no other choice. I couldn't see who she was speaking with, but the other person seemed to be reassuring her." After Guy departed, Miss Marple made her way to the post office, where Mrs. Clement greeted her with the particular excitement of someone bursting with important information. "Such a remarkable coincidence, Miss Marple. You asking about Mrs. Hartwell's registered letter yesterday?" and this morning I find another one, posted just last evening, also addressed to those London solicitors. Same handwriting, though there was something rather careful about it, as if the writer were taking particular pains with the formation of the letters. Miss Marple examined the envelope with interest, noting not only the laboured quality of the script, but also the faint scent that clung to the paper. It was not the rose water that Mrs. Hartwell had favoured, but the sharp, clean smell of lemon oil that had become increasingly familiar over the past few days. "I don't suppose you recall who posted this letter, Mrs. Clement." "Indeed I do, though it was rather late in the day. Lydia Quince came in just before closing, quite flustered she was, saying she'd found the letter among Mrs. Hartwell's things and felt it should be sent on. Very proper of her, I thought, though she did seem anxious about whether it would reach London in time for some important deadline." Walking home through the lengthening afternoon shadows, Miss Marple reflected on the curious persistence of Mrs. Hartwell's correspondence from beyond the grave. The pattern was becoming clearer now, like a photograph developing in its chemical bath. Someone with intimate knowledge of the house, access to private papers, and the skill to forge a convincing hand had been working methodically to ensure that certain information reached London while other, perhaps more dangerous documents disappeared entirely. The blue thread in the drawer, the pale hair in the secret compartment, the forged letter with its telltale lemon scent, Guy's testimony about Lydia's suspicious behavior, all of these pointed toward a conclusion that the village, in its eagerness to blame the obvious suspect, was determinedly ignoring. Miss Marple had observed that the most successful deceptions were often those that encouraged people to see exactly what they expected to see, while the truth polished itself bright and slippery just beyond their notice. The teacup that had tipped itself was beginning to make perfect sense, not as a supernatural occurrence or a mechanical trick, but as the first small test in a carefully orchestrated performance designed to ensure that when the final curtain fell, the audience would applaud the wrong actor entirely. By Wednesday morning, the village had settled into the peculiar rhythm that follows unexpected death, where ordinary tasks continue alongside whispered speculation and the careful rearrangement of social obligations. Miss Marple spent the early hours in her garden, ostensibly tending to her roses, but actually organizing her thoughts with the same methodical precision she applied to her flower beds. The accumulated evidence against Lydia Quince was beginning to form a pattern, but she had learned through long experience that the most dangerous conclusions were often those that appeared too neat. Her first task was a letter to Mrs. Clement for inclusion with the Morning Post. Written in her careful, slightly tremulous hand, it requested acknowledgement from Pember and Wyatt regarding the receipt of Monday's registered letter, and inquired, with the fussy concern of an elderly lady worried about postal efficiency, whether it matched correspondence sent the previous week. The persona of a dotty old woman anxious about mailing procedures had served her well over the years, being both plausible and entirely unthreatening to those who might otherwise guard their secrets more carefully. Her next stop was the village school, where children's voices rose in enthusiastic, if imperfect, harmony during morning hymn practice. Lily Arkwright met her in the corridor, her usual composed manner showing subtle signs of strain. Her smile was perhaps a shade too bright, and her hands displayed the restless energy of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere entirely. When Miss Marple mentioned, with apparent casualness, that a small blue thread had been discovered in Mrs. Hartwell's bureau drawer, Lily's reaction was immediate and telling. Her breath caught audibly, and her gaze flew reflexively to her cuff, which bore the evidence of hasty mending with stitches that spoke of recent repair work. "I should have mentioned it before," Lily confessed, relief and apprehension mingling in her voice like oil and water. "On Monday, I brought a sympathy note to the old rectory. Agnes admitted me to leave it in the morning room, and I noticed the drawer was slightly ajar. I'm afraid curiosity got the better of me. When I touched it to push it closed properly, my sleeve caught on a splinter. I didn't take anything. Truly I didn't. I only saw the faint outline where something rectangular had rested, and there was a tiny scrape of green sealing wax along the interior edge. Miss Marple's expression remained gently encouraging. "How very sensible of you not to meddle further, my dear. It's remarkable how often drawers that don't belong to us present themselves so obligingly half open, isn't it?" The young woman's blush deepened. "If there's any suspicion that I might have—" "My dear child," Miss Marple interrupted with maternal kindness, "if you had taken anything of importance, you would certainly have devised a more convincing explanation than catching your sleeve on a splinter." From the school, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, carrying a basket of early gooseberries and a question about arrangements for the harvest festival decorations. The Reverend Pottle, ever hospitable despite his obvious bewilderment at recent events, produced his writing case when she inquired about organizing the hymn selections. Miss Marple's observant gaze fell upon the squat stick of sealing wax nestled among his correspondence supplies, green as fresh holly and exactly the shade she had been expecting to find. "Lydia borrowed a piece just last week," the Reverend explained with his characteristic absent-minded precision. "Said Mrs. Hartwell preferred the old-fashioned appearance for her more formal correspondence. I warned her it was beastly stuff to work with in this July heat, but she seemed quite determined to have it." "Very thoughtful of her," Miss Marple murmured, filing away this confirmation of who had access to the materials needed for creating convincing forgeries. Her next destination was the chemist's shop, where Mr. Taverner greeted her with the professional courtesy of someone who had dispensed remedies and advice to 3 generations of village families. When she requested his last tin of lemon oil, citing concerns about persistent flies in her pantry, he was happy to oblige while sharing relevant local intelligence. "Curious coincidence, Miss Marple. Lydia Quince was in Saturday morning requesting the very same thing. Also purchased a small bottle of glycerin preparation for her hands. Mentioned that the increased housework was causing chapping." Mr. Taverner's tone carried the satisfaction of someone who took pride in remembering his customers' needs. "Seemed quite urgent about the lemon oil, though I assured her that flies are hardly uncommon in July." Miss Marple thanked him warmly, while mentally noting that Lydia's hands had appeared perfectly smooth and unchapped during their recent encounters, suggesting the glycerine had been intended for some other purpose entirely. As she made her way across the village green, she observed Dr. Brooke and Guy Farnley engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion near the war memorial. Their lowered voices carried with the peculiar acoustics that made private conversations public property in villages designed by Providence for the efficient distribution of news. "It's thoroughly irresponsible to spread unfounded speculation," Dr. Brooke was saying with his customary professional authority. "Your aunt was not a well woman, regardless of appearances." Guy's response carried the heat of genuine frustration. "She cycled to the Downs last Thursday and outpaced Agnes going up the church lane. She told me herself that she had made arrangements that would set me properly on my feet. If that's true, why am I apparently the only beneficiary who had no knowledge of where she kept her important papers?" Miss Marple, pausing to admire a particularly fine rose bush, appeared not to notice the doctor's weary dismissal of such claims as the confused ramblings of someone facing their mortality. That afternoon, she invited Lydia for tea under the pretext of seeking advice about a new rug pattern featured in The Lady magazine. Lydia arrived with punctual precision, her appearance as polished as her reputation for efficiency. She dutifully admired the rug, praised the garden's summer display, and maintained careful attention to anything that might be construed as interrogation. Miss Marple, chatting pleasantly about moths and the shocking increase in egg prices, deliberately moved more slowly than usual at the tea service, creating an opportunity for Lydia's natural instincts to reveal themselves. They did so with telling clarity. Without being asked, Lydia lifted the milk jug and poured a measured stream into Miss Marple's cup before the tea had properly settled, then paused with sudden awareness of her presumption. "I do beg your pardon," she said with quick, bright embarrassment. "Force of habit, I'm afraid." "Such a capable one," Miss Marple replied, tasting the mixture and concealing her private reaction to the combination. You anticipate everything so thoughtfully. I suppose this was how Mrs. Hartwell preferred her tea prepared." "Always," Lydia answered, the word emerging too quickly before she caught herself. After a moment's pause, she qualified with her practiced managerial smile. As a general rule, I mean. Some days she fancied lemon instead. "How wonderfully adaptable of you," Miss Marple murmured, steering the conversation toward the relative merits of drawn thread work in table linens. When she complimented the delicate larkspur embroidery on Lydia's handkerchief corner, she noted the almost imperceptible twitch of the young woman's fingers, as if prepared to snatch something from view. After Lydia departed, Miss Marple remained seated in thoughtful contemplation. Her tea had been prepared without consultation, her preferences assumed rather than inquired about, suggesting a familiarity that belonged to someone who no longer needed to ask, because the answer was already known. In the hallway, she had observed Lydia pause at the umbrella stand to adjust the topmost walking stick by precisely half an inch before replacing it in perfect alignment. An action so automatic as to be unconscious, the behavior of someone accustomed to maintaining exact order in spaces not her own. As evening shadows began to lengthen, Agnes appeared at Miss Marple's gate, still wearing her work apron and carrying the anxious hopefulness of someone bearing important news. "Miss Marple, I think someone was in the morning room again last night," she announced without preamble. "I heard footsteps and what sounded like a latch clicking. I thought it might have been my imagination, but this morning the window catch was polished bright as a new penny, and I know I didn't touch it. I wouldn't dare interfere with Madam's things, not even now." "Quite proper of you," Miss Marple assured, her patting the distraught woman's hand with gentle comfort. "Thank you for telling me. Such details often prove more important than they initially appear." As the village clock struck the half-hour with its customary self-importance, Miss Marple regarded it as if it had announced a verdict. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear, though not yet complete. A woman who arranged objects into their precise positions, correspondence sent posthumously bearing the unmistakable scent of lemon oil, the careful cultivation of suspicion toward the obvious heir, and, beneath it all, something more complex than simple greed. Perhaps it was fear of displacement or the slow burn of long-suppressed resentment, but whatever the true motive, it had been nurtured carefully in the quiet corners of a heart that had learned to hide its true feelings behind a facade of devoted service. Miss Marple took up her pen and composed 2 additional letters. One to the vicar regarding flower arrangements for Sunday service, and another, quite different in tone and purpose, to a gentleman in Much Benham who had known Mrs. Hartwell during her younger years, before any of the current village residents had entered her life. The past, she reflected with the wisdom of considerable experience, was rather like lemon juice applied to a stain. It had the curious property of brightening what it touched, and sometimes, when applied at precisely the right moment, revealed exactly where the original mark had begun. The teacup that had appeared to tip itself was beginning to reveal its true significance, not as supernatural occurrence or mechanical accident, but as the final, careful test in a performance that had been rehearsed over many weeks, ensuring that when the crucial moment arrived, every detail would fall into its predetermined place with the precision of a well-wound clock. Thursday morning brought the correspondence Miss Marple had been quietly expecting, delivered by young Tommy Briggs with a particular solemnity that telegraph boys reserve for messages they sense contain important news. The wire from Pember and Wyatt, Lincoln's Inn, was brief but illuminating in its precision. They acknowledged receipt of Mrs. Hartwell's registered letter containing a signed codicil establishing the old rectory as a village reading room under Miss Lily Arkwright's supervision, with provisions for Guy Farnley, consisting of a modest but adequate annuity. More significantly, they confirmed receipt of a second letter, ostensibly from Mrs. Hartwell, requesting postponement of all filings due to misplaced documents. However, they noted with professional delicacy that while the handwriting bore superficial resemblance to their clients', Certain characteristics and legal phraseology seemed inconsistent with her previous correspondence. Miss Marple shared this intelligence with Constable Bell, who received it with the mixture of relief and apprehension that accompanies the confirmation of suspicions one had hoped might prove unfounded. The revelation that Guy stood to inherit relatively little demolished the foundation of the case against him, while simultaneously raising uncomfortable questions about who possessed both the skill to forge convincing correspondence and the motive to delay Mrs. Hartwell's actual intentions. The news spread through the village with the peculiar velocity that accompanies the overturning of accepted truths. At the post office, Mrs. Clement recalled with newfound significance that Lydia had seemed unusually anxious when posting that second letter, asking repeatedly about delivery times and whether the solicitors might receive it before any other correspondence. The baker mentioned that Lydia had been purchasing unusual quantities of writing paper, claiming Mrs. Hartwell had developed a sudden enthusiasm for extensive correspondence with distant relatives. Miss Marple found Lily at the school, pale with shock at learning of her unexpected inheritance and the responsibilities it would entail. The young woman's distress seemed entirely genuine, untainted by the calculating satisfaction that might be expected from someone who had engineered such an outcome through murderous means. "I cannot understand why Mrs. Hartwell would choose me for such a trust," Lily confessed, her hands trembling as she attempted to organize the children's arithmetic papers. "We spoke occasionally about books and education, but I never imagined she viewed our conversations as anything more than pleasant exchanges between neighbors." Miss Marple offered gentle reassurance while privately noting that Mrs. Hartwell's choice suggested a woman who valued genuine affection over calculated service, a preference that would have been particularly galling to someone who had devoted 15 years to anticipating every need and preference, only to discover that such devotion was viewed as professional duty rather than personal attachment. Her next stop was the old rectory, where she found the atmosphere subtly altered, as if the house itself had begun to hold its breath. Lydia moved through her duties with mechanical precision, but Miss Marple observed that her usual confident efficiency had acquired an edge of desperation. The lemon oil scent that had become her signature now seemed overwhelming, as if applied with increasing frequency to mask other, less pleasant odors. In the morning room, Miss Marple noticed that the writing bureau had been polished to an almost aggressive shine, its brass fittings gleaming with a particular brightness that comes from recent and thorough attention. When she commented on the excellent condition of the furniture, Lydia's response came too quickly, with the practiced smoothness of someone who had rehearsed explanations for anticipated questions. Mrs. Hartwell always insisted on proper care for her good pieces, Lydia explained, her hands smoothing her apron with unconscious repetition. "I felt it important to maintain her standards, even now." Miss Marple murmured appropriate agreement while mentally cataloguing the various ways that thorough cleaning could eliminate inconvenient evidence. The bureau's pristine condition suggested someone had been very careful indeed about removing any traces of unauthorized access to its contents. Dr. Brooke appeared unexpectedly during this conversation, arriving with the brisk authority of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever medical expertise might be required. However, Miss Marple detected an undertone of anxiety beneath his professional manner, particularly when the conversation turned to the solicitor's telegram and its implications for the investigation into Mrs. Hartwell's death. "Perfectly natural to have second thoughts about such significant bequests," he declared with perhaps more emphasis than the observation required. "Women of Mrs. Hartwell's age often become changeable in their final years, questioning decisions they might have made more confidently in their prime." Miss Marple found this assessment curious, given that Dr. Brooke had previously praised Mrs. Hartwell's mental acuity and robust health. The shift in his medical opinion seemed remarkably convenient for someone who might prefer that questions about the circumstances of her death not be pursued too vigorously. That evening brought disturbing news from Agnes. who appeared at Miss Marple's gate with the flustered urgency of someone who had discovered something alarming but wasn't entirely certain of its significance. She had been sorting through Mrs. Hartwell's personal effects when she discovered a small leather journal hidden beneath the lining of a hat box, containing entries that cast recent events in an entirely different light. "She wrote about feeling watched, Miss Marple," Agnes reported, her voice dropping to a whisper despite their privacy. "Not just lately, but for weeks. She mentioned finding things moved in her room, papers disturbed, the feeling that someone had been going through her belongings when she was out. She was planning to dismiss someone from service, but she wanted to gather proper evidence first." Miss Marple accepted this information with the calm of someone whose theories were being confirmed rather than challenged. Mrs. Hartwell's growing paranoia had not been the product of age or illness, but the entirely reasonable response of someone who had discovered that her trust was being systematically betrayed by someone with intimate access to her private affairs. As the village settled into evening quiet, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that was finally revealing itself with crystalline clarity. The teacup that had appeared to tip itself had been the opening movement in a carefully orchestrated performance designed to establish the mechanical unreliability that would later explain away a more significant accident. The forged correspondence, the cleaned bureau, the excessive application of lemon oil to mask other scents. All of these pointed to someone who had been planning Mrs. Hartwell's death with meticulous attention to detail, while simultaneously arranging for suspicion to fall on the obvious beneficiary. The morning would bring the final confrontation, Miss Marple decided, when all the careful deceptions would be laid bare in the morning room where they had begun. The village had been treated to a performance of considerable skill, but like all performances, it had required a stage, props, and an actress capable of maintaining her role even under the pressure of unexpected scrutiny. The teacup had tipped itself because someone had needed to test whether such an apparently supernatural occurrence would be accepted without investigation. Having established that the village was prepared to believe in convenient accidents, the murderer had proceeded with confidence to arrange a much more permanent and profitable accident, secure in the knowledge that the audience would see exactly what they had been conditioned to expect. Tomorrow would reveal whether that confidence had been justified, or whether one elderly lady's inconvenient habit of noticing details would prove sufficient to bring down the curtain on a performance that had been planned with everything except the possibility that someone might be watching from an unexpected angle. Friday morning brought consequences in the form of Constable Bell's grim expression and a house that seemed to hold its breath. The previous night's intrusion had left more than missing documents in its wake. It had shattered the careful facade of normalcy that had been maintained since Mrs. Hartwell's death. Agnes met Miss Marple at the gate with red-rimmed eyes, and the particular exhaustion that comes from sleepless hours spent cataloguing violations of trust. The journal wasn't the only thing taken, Agnes confided as they walked toward the old rectory. "I found scratches around the lock of Mrs. Hartwell's bedroom writing desk, and her correspondence file had been disturbed." "Someone went through everything systematically, Miss Marple. They knew exactly what they were looking for." The Morning Post brought illumination in the form of a letter from Much Benham, written in the careful script of someone who had wrestled with conscience and found duty the victor. Mr. Eustace Fielding's correspondence revealed that Mrs. Hartwell had contacted him 3 weeks prior, seeking advice about documenting systematic theft by a trusted household member. She had discovered discrepancies in her accounts stretching back several years. Small amounts taken with calculated regularity, never enough to notice immediately, but substantial when accumulated over time. She was methodical in her approach, Mr. Fielding had written. She wanted irrefutable evidence before taking action, as she understood the serious consequences such accusations would bring. She mentioned feeling watched and having the distinct impression that her private papers had been examined during her absences from the house. Miss Marple shared this intelligence with Constable Bell, who received it with the mixture of relief and apprehension that accompanies the transformation of confused suspicions into clear criminal charges. The revelation that Mrs. Hartwell had been conducting her own investigation explained her recent secretiveness, her careful attention to locked drawers, and, most significantly, why her death had become a matter of desperate necessity for someone whose entire future depended on avoiding exposure. At the old rectory, they found Dr. Brooke in earnest conversation with Lydia in the morning room, both parties maintaining the sort of careful composure that suggested their discussion had been interrupted rather than concluded. The doctor's usual professional confidence seemed somewhat strained, while Lydia's perpetual efficiency had acquired an edge of brittle determination that made her movements seem mechanical rather than natural. "Ah, Miss Marple," Dr. Brooke greeted her with forced joviality. "I was just discussing with Miss Quince the arrangements for transferring Mrs. Hartwell's medical records. Purely routine, of course, but one must observe proper procedures in these matters." Miss Marple settled herself with her knitting and observed the subtle interplay between doctor and housekeeper with the attention she might have given to a complex pattern requiring careful counting of stitches. There was something in their shared glances, their coordinated responses to questions that suggested a familiarity extending beyond the professional courtesies typically exchanged between medical practitioner and domestic staff. "How fortunate that you recommended Miss Quince to Mrs. Hartwell all those years ago," Miss Marple remarked with apparent casualness. "Such connections often prove invaluable in small communities." Dr. Brooke's pause was almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple's trained observation caught the momentary tightening around his eyes before his professional mask reasserted itself. "Indeed, I've always believed in the importance of proper references when placing domestic staff. Miss Quince came with excellent credentials from her previous position." Lydia's hands, which had been arranging tea things with mechanical precision, stilled for a moment before resuming their task. Miss Marple noted that the familiar scent of lemon oil seemed particularly strong today, as if applied with more than usual liberality to mask other, less pleasant odors. "I've been thinking about that curious business with the teacup on Saturday," Miss Marple continued in her gentle conversational tone. "Such an odd thing, the way it seemed to move of its own accord, almost as if someone were testing whether unusual occurrences would be accepted without question. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft clink of china and the distant sound of Agnes moving about her duties in the passage. Lydia's movements had become increasingly deliberate, each gesture performed with the careful attention of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere entirely. Constable Bell cleared his throat and consulted his notebook. "Miss Quince, I wonder if you might clarify a few points about Saturday afternoon. Several witnesses have mentioned seeing you carry a tea service into the house shortly before Mrs. Hartwell was discovered. Could you describe exactly what occurred during that time?" Lydia's response came with the practiced smoothness of someone who had rehearsed explanations for anticipated questions. "Mrs. Hartwell requested tea in the morning room rather than the garden. I simply provided what she asked for and left her to enjoy it in private. She seemed perfectly well when I last saw her." "Yet the saucer bore traces of milk," Miss Marple observed mildly, "when Mrs. Hartwell invariably preferred lemon." Agnes confirmed this preference most emphatically. "Perhaps she was feeling unwell and thought milk might be more settling," Lydia suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "People sometimes change their habits when they're not feeling quite themselves." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm while her mind catalogued the accumulating evidence of deception. The forged correspondence, the systematic theft, the careful arrangement of Mrs. Hartwell's death to appear natural, all pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the household, access to private papers, and the medical sophistication to understand how digitalis might mimic heart failure in a woman of Mrs. Hartwell's age. "Dr. Brooke," she said suddenly, "I'm curious about your assessment of Mrs. Hartwell's health in her final weeks. Did she consult you about any particular concerns?" The doctor's professional manner became noticeably more guarded. Patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing specific details, but I can say that she had been experiencing some anxiety, possibly related to her advancing years. Such symptoms are not uncommon in elderly patients. How interesting that her anxiety should prove so well-founded, Miss Marple murmured. After all, someone really was watching her, going through her papers, planning her death with considerable care and medical knowledge. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Dr. Brooks' face had gone pale, while Lydia gripped the edge of the tea table with white-knuckled intensity. The careful alliance between them was beginning to show cracks under the pressure of Miss Marple's relentless logic. "I think," Miss Marple continued with deceptive gentleness, "that it's time we discussed exactly how Mrs. Hartwell came to drink tea containing foxglove extract, who had the botanical knowledge to prepare such a mixture, and why two people who should have been protecting her health instead conspired to end her life. The morning, the room, which had witnessed the planning and execution of murder, now hosted the careful unraveling of the conspiracy that had made it possible. Outside, the village continued its daily routines, unaware that justice was finally closing in on those who had mistaken trust for weakness and loyalty for opportunity. As the clock struck the half-hour, Miss Marple prepared for the final confrontation that would expose not just a single murderer, but the calculated partnership that had made Mrs. Hartwell's death both possible and, in the minds of her killers, necessary. The teacup that had appeared to tip itself was about to reveal its true significance as the opening move in a game where the stakes had been nothing less than life itself. The accusation settled over the morning room like morning mist, visible yet insubstantial, until the sun of scrutiny burned it away to reveal the landscape beneath. Miss Marple's gentle words had transformed the familiar space into something altogether different, not merely the scene of a crime, but a stage where 15 years of careful deception would finally be exposed to the unforgiving light of truth. Dr. Brooke found his voice first, though it emerged with less authority than he had intended. "Miss Marple, these are very serious allegations. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such extraordinary claims." "Evidence?" Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, as if the revelation of murder were no more disturbing than a dropped stitch. "Oh, yes. I believe we have quite enough of that. But first, I wonder if Miss Quince might be so kind as to demonstrate exactly how she served tea to Mrs. Hartwell on Saturday afternoon. You have such an excellent memory for routine, my dear, and precision is so important in these matters." Lydia's hands trembled slightly as she approached the tea service, but her movements retained the automatic efficiency of 15 years' practice. Without hesitation, she lifted the milk jug and poured a measured stream into an empty cup, the white liquid pooling in the bottom like accumulated guilt. Only then did she reach for the teapot, adding tea to the waiting milk with the unconscious certainty of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. "How very illuminating," Miss Marple observed with gentle satisfaction. "You prepared the tea exactly as you always did. Milk first, then tea. The difficulty, of course, is that Mrs. Hartwell never took milk. Agnes confirmed that she always preferred lemon, said milk made her feel queer. Yet there was that telltale crescent on the saucer by the window, wasn't there? The mark of milk where none should have been. The silence that followed was broken only by Constable Bell's pencil moving across his notebook. Lydia's face had gone pale as the milk she had just poured, while Dr. Brooke shifted uncomfortably, his professional composure beginning to crack under the weight of implication. "The teacup that appeared to tip itself on Saturday was your test, wasn't it?" Miss Marple continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of her words. "You needed to know whether the village would accept small, inexplicable accidents without question. When that broken cup was dismissed as a simple mishap, you knew your audience was prepared to believe in convenient coincidences." Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and withdrew a small evidence envelope, its contents visible through the transparent material. "The fragments of that test cup have been most revealing. They contained traces of digitalis, foxglove extract, prepared with considerable botanical knowledge. Someone had been experimenting with dosages, hadn't they, Dr. Brooke? Making certain the mixture would be potent enough to stop a heart, but subtle enough to avoid immediate detection. Dr. Brooke's medical training asserted itself in a desperate attempt at professional authority. Even if such wild theories had any foundation, you would need to prove administration and intent. Mrs. Hartwell died of natural causes, a cardiac event entirely consistent with her age and constitution. Cardiac events can indeed be induced, Doctor, as you well know. Digitalis, when properly prepared and administered, mimics heart failure so perfectly that only the most specific tests would detect its presence. Miss Marple's gaze moved between doctor and housekeeper, noting the subtle communications that passed between them even now. The partnership was quite elegant, really. Dr. Brooke provided the medical knowledge necessary to prepare an undetectable poison, while Miss Quince provided access to Mrs. Hartwell's private routine and the means of administration. The careful alliance between conspirators began to show its first cracks. Lydia's composure, maintained through years of practiced deference, finally shattered under the pressure of exposure. "She was going to destroy me," she burst out, her voice cracking with suppressed resentment. "After 15 years of devoted service, she was ready to cast me aside like a broken dish. All because of a few pounds here and there, money she would never have missed if she hadn't become so suspicious, so determined to find fault where none existed." "Ah, but there was fault, wasn't there?" Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her words carried the weight of accumulated evidence. The systematic theft, carefully documented in Mrs. Hartwell's journal. The forged correspondence to delay her true will from taking effect. The green sealing wax borrowed from the vicarage. The pale hair caught in the secret compartment of the bureau. The blue thread from your dress snagged on the drawer's splinter when you emptied it of incriminating documents. Dr. Brooke stepped away from Lydia with the instinctive movement of someone distancing himself from contamination. "I never agreed to murder," he protested desperately. "Miss Quince came to me with concerns about Mrs. Hartwell's mental state," suggested the old woman was becoming dangerously paranoid. "I provided medical consultation in good faith." "Liar!" Lydia's voice rose to a pitch that made the china rattle on its shelves. "You knew exactly what the digitalis was for. You prepared the extract yourself, told me precisely how much to use, even suggested the timing to make it appear most natural. You said it would be simple, a little something in her tea after the garden party, when everyone had gone home and she was alone with her suspicions. The morning room, which had witnessed 15 years of careful service and systematic betrayal, now hosted the complete dissolution of the conspiracy that had made Mrs. Hartwell's death both possible and profitable. The evidence accumulated like layers of sediment. The forged letters with their telltale lemon oil scent, the cleaned bureau with its suspiciously bright window latch, the excessive polishing designed to eliminate traces of unauthorized access. Miss Marple watched this breakdown with the detached interest of someone observing a predictable chemical reaction. The truly remarkable aspect was your assumption that suspicion would naturally fall on Guy Farnley. His financial difficulties, his inheritance expectations, his nervous behavior, all seemed to point toward obvious guilt. But you overlooked the fundamental truth that genuine grief cannot be counterfeited, while calculated innocence often betrays itself through excessive performance. Constable Bell closed his notebook with the quiet authority of justice finally asserting itself. "Dr. Brooke, Miss Quince, I must ask you to accompany me to the station. You are under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Octavia Hartwell." As the formal words of caution filled the morning room, Miss Marple reflected on the curious persistence of human nature in revealing itself through the smallest details. The teacup that had seemed to move of its own accord, the milk where lemon should have been, the saucer that waited with its crescent of guilt, all had been intended as minor elements in a grand deception, but each had carried within it the seeds of exposure. Lydia made no protest as the handcuffs clicked into place, her defiance utterly spent. She looked suddenly older, diminished, the meticulous housekeeper replaced by a woman consumed by her own bitter resentments. Dr. Brooks seemed to deflate entirely, his professional dignity evaporating like morning mist under the harsh sun of revelation. The village would spend weeks discussing the shocking discovery that their trusted doctor and devoted housekeeper had conspired to murder the woman they were supposed to protect. But Miss Marple, who had observed the careful choreography of their deception from the beginning, found nothing particularly surprising in the revelation that trust, when systematically betrayed, eventually transforms into something far more dangerous than simple greed. As the arrests proceeded, with their measured formality, the July morning continued its gentle progress toward afternoon, indifferent to human schemes and their inevitable consequences. Justice had taken its course, guided by the patient observations of an elderly lady who had never forgotten that the most dangerous assumptions were often the most reasonable ones, and that the truth, however carefully buried, had a way of surfacing when examined with sufficient care and wisdom. The teacup that had tipped itself had indeed revealed far more than spilled tea. It had been the first note in a symphony of deception that had played its final, discordant chord in the morning room where it began. The morning room fell into profound silence after Constable Bell departed with his prisoners, leaving behind only the lingering scent of lemon oil and the peculiar emptiness that follows the resolution of long-held secrets. Miss Marple remained in her chair by the window, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm while the village began its necessary process of understanding how thoroughly it had been deceived. Agnes appeared in the doorway, her face bearing the complicated mixture of relief and bewilderment that accompanies the discovery that one's suspicions were both justified and woefully inadequate. "I knew something wasn't right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I never imagined Dr. Brooke could be capable of such wickedness, and Miss Quince seemed so devoted to Madame's welfare." Miss Marple nodded with the gentle understanding of someone who had observed the careful cultivation of appearances for more than 70 years. Devotion can become quite dangerous when it masks other motivations, my dear. Miss Quince's devotion was genuine enough, but it was devotion to her own position rather than to Mrs. Hartwell's well-being. When that position was threatened by discovery of her thefts, devotion transformed into something altogether more sinister. Guy Farnley arrived as word of the arrests spread through the village, his relief at vindication tempered by genuine grief at the circumstances that had made vindication necessary. He settled heavily into one of the morning room's chairs, running his hands through his disheveled hair as the weight of false accusation lifted, replaced by the grim reality of his aunt's calculated murder. "She must have suspected something," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Those questions she asked about my prospects, her hints about making proper arrangements for my future. She was trying to protect me from suspicion while gathering evidence against the real criminals." Miss Marple confirmed this assessment with the authority of someone who had pieced together Mrs. Hartwell's final weeks from fragments of evidence and careful deduction. She was quite methodical in her approach. The registered letters to London, the hidden journal documenting suspicious incidents, the secret compartment cleared of its contents, all pointed to a woman who had discovered systematic betrayal in her own household and was building a legal case through proper channels. When Constable Bell returned to collect Dr. Brooks' forgotten medical bag, he lingered long enough to express his gratitude and seek clarification on the technical aspects of the crime. Miss Marple obliged with her characteristic precision, explaining how the teacup that had seemed to move of its own accord had been the opening movement in a carefully orchestrated performance. "The trick was quite ingenious in its simplicity," she explained, her tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of her words. Miss Quince had prepared the trestle cloth, with a thin smear of glycerin beneath where she intended to place the cup, on a surface very slightly inclined toward the table's edge. The combination of warm tea, slicked china, and that invisible film produced a slow, convincing slide that became, at the crucial moment, a gentle tumble. It was her test of the villagers' willingness to accept inexplicable accidents without investigation. The poison itself had worn an equally domestic disguise. Miss Quince's habit of adding milk first had been automatic as breathing, and digitalis dissolved well in warm milk, while its natural bitterness was effectively masked. Mrs. Hartwell's preference for lemon had been village knowledge, making the crescent of milk on the morning room saucer a silent confession to anyone observant enough to notice the discrepancy. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Lily Arkwright joined them, still struggling to comprehend her unexpected inheritance and the responsibilities it would entail. The prospect of transforming the old rectory into a village reading room seemed overwhelming, but Miss Marple assured her that Mrs. Hartwell's choice had been made with careful consideration of both capability and character. She valued genuine affection over calculated service, Miss Marple observed. Your conversations about books and education meant more to her than 15 years of efficient household management motivated by self-interest. She recognized in you the sort of person who would preserve the house's character while making it genuinely useful to the community. The village's reaction to the arrests followed predictable patterns, with shock giving way to retrospective wisdom as various residents recalled incidents that now seemed significant in light of recent revelations. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that she had always found Dr. Brooks' manner somewhat calculating, while the Misses Weatherby remembered occasions when Lydia had seemed unusually interested in their discussions of Mrs. Hartwell's financial affairs. At the post office, Mrs. Clement spoke with newfound authority about the suspicious frequency of Lydia's recent correspondence inquiries. Miss Marple listened to these post facto observations with the tolerant amusement of someone who understood that human memory was remarkably adaptable when faced with uncomfortable truths. The reality was that both conspirators had maintained their deceptions with considerable skill, exploiting the natural tendency of small communities to trust familiar faces and established reputations. The investigation had revealed layers of deception that went far beyond simple murder. The systematic embezzlement stretching back years, the forged correspondence designed to delay Mrs. Hartwell's true will, the careful manipulation of evidence to implicate an innocent man, all spoke to minds that had planned not merely a single crime, but an entire reconstruction of truth to serve their purposes. They had counted on the village's willingness to accept obvious explanations and overlook inconvenient details, never imagining that one elderly lady's habit of noticing small inconsistencies would prove sufficient to unravel their carefully constructed lies. As evening approached, Miss Marple made her final visit to the morning room where the case had begun and ended. The writing bureau stood open, its secret compartment no longer concealing stolen documents. The tea service had been cleared away, removing the physical evidence of the last fatal cup that Mrs. Hartwell had never lived to finish. Only the window remained as it had been, its latch polished bright as a warning that had come too late. Walking home through the village streets as the church clock struck 6, Miss Marple reflected on the insidious nature of resentment and the corrupting power of fear. It was not grand passions that often led to such crimes, but the quiet, persistent accumulation of small grievances, small desires, small anxieties, festering unseen until they erupted in violence. The seemingly placid surface of village life, like a tranquil pond, often concealed currents and depths far more treacherous than any turbulent sea. The village would eventually return to a semblance of normalcy, but it would be a new normal, forever altered by the knowledge that evil could wear the most respectable of faces, that treachery could hide behind a meticulously polished exterior. The summer tea party, once a charming memory, would now be tinged with the shadow of what had truly occurred beneath its innocent facade. The old rectory would soon begin its transformation into the reading room that Mrs. Hartwell had envisioned, a place where knowledge would be preserved and shared rather than hoarded and manipulated. It seemed a fitting memorial to a woman who had valued truth enough to risk her life in its pursuit, even though that pursuit had ultimately cost her everything she had sought to protect. As Miss Marple settled into her own sitting room with her evening tea, She reflected that justice, like the finest blend, required patience, proper preparation, and the wisdom to know exactly when the moment was right for revelation. The teacup that had seemed to tip itself had indeed revealed far more than spilled tea. It had been the first note in a symphony of deception that had played its final, discordant chord in the very room where it began. The conspiracy had been elaborate, and the conspirators clever, but they had made the fundamental error of assuming that their audience was neither observant nor intelligent enough to see through their performance. In her considerable experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous assumptions were often the most reasonable ones, and that truth, however carefully buried, had a persistent way of surfacing when examined with sufficient care and wisdom. The innocence of St. Mary Mead, like a delicate piece of china, had been irrevocably cracked, and though the pieces might be carefully mended, the fault lines would always remain visible, a testament to the deadly secrets that had simmered beneath the surface of a perfectly ordinary English village, waiting for one small teacup to tip the balance between deception and discovery. 3 months after the arrests, autumn had settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle melancholy that accompanies the turning of seasons and the resolution of long-held secrets. The trial of Dr. Brooke and Lydia Quince had concluded with sentences that reflected both the gravity of premeditated murder and the particular betrayal of trust their crimes represented. The village had followed the proceedings with fascination and horror, gradually accepting that evil could indeed wear the most familiar of faces and speak with the most trusted of voices. The old rectory had undergone its promised transformation, emerging from its shroud of tragedy as the village reading room that Mrs. Hartwell had envisioned. Lily Arkwright had proven herself worthy of the trust placed in her, managing the conversion with quiet competence while preserving the house's essential character. The morning room, once the scene of calculated murder, now housed shelves of donated books, their colorful spines creating rainbows of knowledge where secrets had once festered in locked drawers. The writing bureau remained in its familiar position by the window, but its compartments now held lending records and correspondence with other libraries, its brass fittings gleaming with honest polish applied by willing hands. Guy Farnley had used his modest inheritance wisely, abandoning his theatrical aspirations for employment with a London publishing house, where his education and natural intelligence served him well. He visited monthly, bringing flowers to his aunt's grave and expressing continued gratitude to Miss Marple for her patient unravelling of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed his future. Agnes had found new purpose as housekeeper to the vicar, her honest grief for Mrs. Hartwell gradually giving way to renewed contentment, though she still occasionally glanced over her shoulder, a habit ingrained by years of subtle unease. The village itself bore invisible scars from its encounter with sophisticated deception. Conversations at the post office carried undertones of caution that had not existed before, and social gatherings retained the faint shadow of awareness that appearances could be devastatingly misleading. Yet in this wariness, Miss Marple observed a curious form of growth. People were perhaps less quick to judge on surface appearances, more inclined to look beneath the veneer of respectability. On this particular October afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden where the last roses clung to their fading beauty, reminding her of Mrs. Hartwell's own deceptive fragility. Her knitting needles moved with their familiar rhythm as she reflected on the case that had begun with a teacup appearing to move of its own accord. That small, seemingly insignificant event had been the first crack in an elaborate facade, the initial note in a symphony of deception that had ultimately revealed the dangerous currents flowing beneath village life's placid surface. The partnership between doctor and housekeeper had been founded on mutual need rather than genuine affection, each providing capabilities the other lacked. Their downfall had come not from dramatic errors, but from the accumulation of small inconsistencies, the milk where lemons should have been, the lemon oil scent on forged correspondence, The blue thread caught on a splinter, the careful arrangement of that test teacup that had defied both gravity and probability. These were the human errors, the subtle deviations from expected patterns that spoke volumes to an observant eye, trained by decades of experience in reading the intricate text of human behavior. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous crimes were often those that appeared most natural, committed by individuals whose reputations provided both opportunity and protection. The case had reminded the village that trust, while necessary for community life, must be tempered with wisdom and observation. The reading room would stand as a monument to truth's triumph over deception, ensuring that Mrs. Hartwell's final wishes were honored, despite the elaborate conspiracy designed to subvert them. As evening shadows lengthened across her garden, Miss Marple reflected that the greatest satisfaction came not from dramatic revelations of guilt, but from the patient restoration of truth to its proper place in the world. The village would eventually forget specific details, but the lessons learned would endure in subtle changes to daily life, increased awareness of evil's potential to hide behind respectable facades, understanding that the most reasonable assumptions could be the most dangerous ones. The teacup that had seemed to tip itself had indeed revealed far more than spilled tea. It had been the opening movement in a carefully orchestrated performance that had played its final, discordant chord in the very room where it began, leaving behind only the gentle harmony of justice served and truth preserved. In the peaceful routine of St. Mary Mead, where ordinary life continued its eternal patterns beneath watchful eyes that understood the complexity hidden within apparent simplicity, Miss Marple continued her knitting, her observations, and her quiet guardianship of truth in a world that sometimes preferred convenient lies to challenging reality. The case was closed, the village was safe, and in the gathering dusk all was once again as it should be.